Welcome back to The Things That Bother Me. This is America. The Damage is Permanent. Episode 3, Control Replaced Freedom. If you've been following this series, then you already know. This isn't random, this isn't accidental, and it's definitely not temporary. Something changed in this country. Not in a way that made headlines, not in a way people could point to and say, that's when it happened. But it happened. Slow, quiet, consistent. And it wasn't just about what was lost, it was about what replaced it. Control replaced freedom. Not by force, not overnight, but in a way that felt logical, necessary, even responsible. And that's why most people didn't push back, because it didn't feel like control. It felt like order. Episode 1 exposed the divide. Episode 2 showed how truth started breaking down. But this episode, this is where it all connects. Because division and confusion don't just exist on their own. They create the perfect conditions for control to take hold and stay there. This isn't about politics. It's not about sides. It's about the system, how it operates, how it evolves, and how it reshapes reality without most people ever realizing it. So if you're looking for comfort, you won't find it here. But if you're ready to see things for what they are, let's get into it. America. The damage is permanent. Episode 3, Control Replaced Freedom. It didn't end with sirens. There were no alarms echoing through cities. No breaking news moment where the screen went black and someone announced that freedom had officially expired. No line in the sand people could point to and say, that's where it stopped. That's not how it happened. It faded. It dissolved slowly into something quieter, something more controlled, something easier to manage. And because it didn't feel like collapse, because it felt like adjustment, people kept moving forward as if nothing fundamental had changed. But everything had. Freedom didn't die in chaos. It died in comfort. It was negotiated away in small, reasonable decisions. It was chipped down through policies that sounded necessary. It was softened through language that made control feel responsible. And over time, what replaced it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like structure. That's how you lose something permanent. Not by having it taken, but by agreeing to let it go, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to defend. And now we're standing in the aftermath of something most people still refuse to name. Not a collapse, a transition. From freedom to control. Section 1, the quiet replacement. It didn't feel like something was being removed. It felt like something was being improved. Systems became more efficient. Rules became more refined. Oversight became more sophisticated. Every step forward came with justification. And every justification sounded reasonable enough that resisting it felt irrational. That's how the replacement worked. Nothing disappeared outright. It was substituted. Freedom of movement became regulated access. Freedom of speech became monitored expression. Freedom of choice became structured options. The language stayed the same, but the meaning underneath it shifted. Slowly, subtly, until people were using the same words to describe something entirely different. And because the words didn't change, most people never realized the reality had. They still said free. They still believed it. But what they were living inside of was something far more controlled than anything they would have accepted if it had been presented honestly from the start. Section 2, the selection machine. Elections still happen. The rituals remain. Campaigns, debates, voting days, they all continue like nothing has fundamentally changed. And on the surface, it looks intact. It looks like democracy is still functioning exactly as it should. But beneath that surface is a filtration system most people never see. Candidates don't rise naturally anymore. They are scaled, elevated, funded, positioned. Before a name ever becomes familiar, it has already passed through layers of approval. Donor viability, institutional compatibility, media alignment, network support. A campaign doesn't grow, it disappears. Money decides who becomes visible, and visibility decides who becomes real. By the time the public is asked to choose, the field has already been narrowed. Not through conspiracy, but through structure. Through cost barriers, access points, and influence networks that quietly determine who gets to compete at a level that matters. So yes, people vote, but they are voting on outcomes shaped long before their participation begins. That's not the death of elections, that's the transformation of them. Section 3. Wealth as Architecture. Power doesn't sit in one place anymore. It's distributed through wealth. Billionaires, corporate networks, political action committees, lobbying organizations, they don't operate as a single force, but they don't need to. Their influence converges naturally, shaping the same outcomes through aligned interests. Campaigns are funded, narratives are amplified, policies are drafted before they're debated, and access, real access, is reserved for those who can operate at that level. It's not hidden, it's built into the system. Groups like American Israel Public Affairs Committee, National Rifle Association, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce don't control everything, but they represent how influence operates, organized, persistent, and deeply embedded. And then there are the donors you don't see, the networks that don't advertise, the capital that moves quietly, shaping outcomes without ever stepping into public view. That's where the real architecture is, not in headlines, in infrastructure. Section 4. The End of Organic Reality. Nothing is fully organic anymore. Information is filtered, amplified, suppressed, directed, not always by a single hand, but by systems designed to prioritize engagement, alignment, and control. What people see isn't necessarily false, but it's not neutral. It's curated. And when reality is curated, perception becomes programmable. People believe they're forming independent opinions, but those opinions are shaped by what they're exposed to, and what they're exposed to is no longer random. It's selected, refined, and delivered in ways that guide reaction. That's not chaos. That's design. Section 5. Surveillance that feels like participation. No one had to force surveillance into people's lives. People invited it. They carry it in their pockets. They integrate it into their homes. They build their lives around systems that track, analyze, and record everything they do. And they do it willingly, because it's convenient, because it's normalized, because it doesn't feel like control. It feels like connection. But the data doesn't disappear. It accumulates, it learns, it predicts, it adapts. And once behavior becomes predictable, it becomes manageable. That's the shift, from observing people to shaping them. Section 6. Fear as Atmosphere. Fear doesn't need to spike anymore. It just needs to linger. Not overwhelming, not paralyzing, just present enough to influence decisions. Economic instability, social backlash, institutional consequences, the fear of being wrong, of being targeted, of stepping outside accepted boundaries. It's subtle, but it's constant. And constant fear changes behavior more effectively than sudden crisis ever could. It keeps people cautious, measured, self-regulating. They don't need to be told where the lines are. They learn to sense them. And once people start policing themselves, the system doesn't need to. Section 7. The Collapse of Resistance. Resistance doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes. Not because people suddenly agree with everything happening around them, but because they lose the ability to clearly define what they're even resisting. The signal gets buried under noise. Truth gets tangled with distortion. Every narrative is countered. Every fact is questioned. Every position is attacked from multiple directions at once. And eventually, people stop trying to sort it out. Not because they don't care, but because they're overwhelmed. Information overload isn't an accident. It's a condition. A constant flood of headlines, opinions, outrage, contradictions. Just enough truth mixed with just enough manipulation to make certainty feel impossible. And when people can't find solid ground, they stop standing firm on anything at all. They retreat into what feels manageable: personal life, immediate concerns, survival-level focus. And resistance requires energy. Focused, sustained energy. But exhaustion kills that. Mental fatigue kills that. The slow grind of uncertainty, stress, and constant distraction wears people down until pushing back feels like a burden instead of a necessity. So they don't push, they scroll, they react, they move on, and over time, that pattern becomes the new baseline. No unified resistance, no coordinated pressure, no collective clarity, just scattered frustration that never builds into anything strong enough to matter. That's how control stabilizes. Not by crushing resistance, but by exhausting it before it ever has the chance to form. Section 8. The system that can't be turned off. People still talk about fixing the system like it's a machine you can shut down, repair, and restart. It's not. This isn't a single structure, it's a network. Financial systems tied to digital systems, tied to governance, tied to infrastructure, tied to daily survival. Everything is interconnected now. Every part relies on every other part to keep functioning. You don't remove something like that cleanly. You disrupt it, and disruption spreads. That's what makes it untouchable in practice. Not because it's perfect, not because it's just, but because it's embedded so deeply into everyday life that pulling it apart doesn't feel like reform, it feels like collapse. And most people won't choose collapse, they'll choose stability, even if that stability comes with limits, surveillance, control, and restriction layered into it. Because uncertainty is harder to face than control you've learned to live with. That's the trap. The system doesn't need to defend itself aggressively. It just needs to exist at a scale where removing it feels more dangerous than keeping it. So even people who see the problems stay inside it. They adjust, they adapt, they survive within it. Because the alternative isn't clearly defined, it's just risk. It's something most people won't take. That's what makes it permanent. Not that it can't be challenged, but that it's too integrated to be removed without consequences people aren't willing to face. Section 9. Division as a containment field. Division isn't just happening, it's functioning. People are locked into horizontal conflict, left versus right, group versus group, identity versus identity. Every issue becomes a battlefield, every disagreement becomes personal, and every conversation escalates into something that pulls attention sideways instead of upward. That's the containment. Because while people are fighting each other, they're not examining the structure above them. They're not analyzing the systems shaping their reality. They're not asking larger questions about power, influence, or control. They're reacting, and reaction is predictable. It's easier to manage, easier to guide, easier to keep contained within boundaries that never threaten the system itself. Outrage cycles, narrative battles, cultural conflicts, all of it keeps energy circulating at ground level. It never consolidates, because consolidation would require unity. And unity, real unity, not surface-level agreement, is the one force that disrupts everything. It cuts through noise. It redirects attention upward. It creates pressure that systems can't easily absorb. So it doesn't happen, not at scale. Instead, people stay divided, convinced the person next to them is the problem, while the structure shaping both of them continues operating without interruption. That's not dysfunction. That's containment. Section 10. The point where it became permanent. There wasn't a single moment where everything crossed a line. There were thousands of moments, small ones, quiet ones, decisions that felt temporary, adjustments that felt necessary, trade-offs that felt reasonable at the time. Each one insignificant on its own, but cumulative over time. That's how permanence is built. Not through one irreversible act, but through a series of changes that slowly remove the possibility of going back. Not because people aren't allowed to, but because the path back becomes harder to see, harder to define, harder to even imagine. And eventually, it disappears. That's where it stands now. Not at the beginning of the shift, but long after it, deep inside a structure that has already adapted, already reinforced itself, already integrated into daily life in ways most people don't even recognize anymore. This isn't something sitting on top of society. It is society. It's how things function, how decisions get made, how access is granted, how limitations are enforced. It's embedded in systems people rely on every single day, and that reliance is what locks it in place. Because once a system becomes necessary, Challenging it feels like self-destruction, and that's the final barrier. Not force, not law, dependence. That's what makes it permanent. Not that change is impossible, but that the cost of change feels higher than the cost of staying exactly where things are. And as long as that equation holds, nothing moves. In closing, there's a difference between losing something and forgetting what it was. Losing something hurts. It creates resistance. It forces people to react, to question, to push back against whatever took it from them. But forgetting is quieter. It doesn't create urgency. It doesn't create conflict. It creates acceptance. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. Because freedom wasn't just reduced, it was redefined so gradually that people stopped measuring it against what it used to be. They stopped comparing. They stopped asking whether what they had now matched what they were told it once was. Instead, they adjusted their expectations downward, little by little, until the version of freedom they were living with felt normal, manageable, even sufficient. But normal doesn't mean intact, and sufficient doesn't mean real. What exists now is a version of freedom that operates inside boundaries most people can't see, because those boundaries aren't enforced with force. They're enforced with friction, with inconvenience, with subtle consequences that don't feel like punishment, but feel just heavy enough to discourage deviation. That's the design. Not to stop people outright, but to make stepping outside the system feel harder than staying inside it. And over time, people stop trying, not because they agree with everything, not because they trust everything, but because the effort required to resist no longer feels worth it compared to the comfort of compliance. That's how control stabilizes, not through dominance, but through preference. And once that preference sets in, once enough people choose the path of least resistance consistently, the system no longer needs to prove itself. It doesn't need to justify its existence. It doesn't need to explain its boundaries. It simply continues, expanding quietly, reinforcing itself structurally, embedding deeper into daily life until it becomes indistinguishable from the way things are supposed to be. And at that point, the conversation changes. It's no longer about reclaiming freedom. It's about whether people even recognize what's missing. Because you can't fight for something you can't clearly define. You can't restore something you've stopped remembering. And right now, most people don't see a system that replaced freedom. They see the only system they believe can work. That's the final shift. When control stops feeling imposed and starts feeling necessary. When limitation stops feeling restrictive and starts feeling responsible. When the structure becomes so normalized that questioning it feels irrational instead of essential. That's when it locks in. Not through force, not through fear, but through belief. And belief is harder to break than any law, any policy, any system ever created. Because once people internalize the limits placed around them, those limits no longer need to be enforced from the outside. They carry them, they defend them, they pass them on. And that's how something becomes permanent. Not because it can't be changed, but because the will to change it fades before the system ever has to be challenged. So this isn't about panic. It's about clarity. It's about recognizing that what feels stable might actually be controlled, that what feels normal might actually be limited, that what feels like freedom might only exist within boundaries designed to keep it contained. And once you see that clearly, once you strip away the language, the framing, the justifications, you're left with something uncomfortable but undeniable. This didn't happen to people, it happened with them. Step by step, decision by decision, trade-off by trade-off, until the system didn't need to take anything anymore, because there was nothing left people were willing to protect. And that's where it stands now. Not at the moment of loss, but long after it. In a place where the structure is set, the boundaries are normalized, and the question isn't whether things changed. It's whether anyone is still willing to admit how much it has changed. As we close this one out, understand something clearly. This isn't about what might happen. It's about what's already in motion. And if you're seeing it, even just a little clearer than before, then you're already ahead of where most people are willing to look. because the next step isn't just recognizing the system, it's understanding it. And that's exactly where we're going next. Episode 4. The system isn't broken. It's working as designed. That's where things stop looking accidental and start making a lot more sense. If this hit you, if it made you think, if it bothered you even a little, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe below, because this conversation doesn't go anywhere if it stays silent. This is the things that bother me. Until next time.